I'm Radha Mistry, and you're listening to Future Feelings in collaboration with Dean Audio. The study, the science, and the art of understanding the unknown and preparing for the future has long been a preoccupation of humankind and is of particular concern to designers, especially as the stakes of our global present feel so high. As a designer with a background that spans architecture, narrative environments, and strategic foresight, I'm here to help you unpack the purpose and practice of futuring through 5 interviews with practitioners who approach this work in myriad ways. Now, let's jump right in.
My name is Macy. I am, how should I describe myself? I guess I always like to use the term in between or quite hyphenated in various different ways. So I have an art background, but then also a law background, and also now seeped into the design world. Lately, I've been doing a lot more design research, service design work, but also have or like to kind of maintain a creative practice within the foresight practice. And that's also usually my collaborations with Rob there. Yeah, that's a little bit of a nutshell.
I'm Robert Bolton. I am an artist, a strategist, a writer, and the founder of From Later, which is a foresight studio in Toronto. That's what we call it. And our practice at From Later is devoted to speculative and long-term thinking and a mix of speculative design, strategic foresight, generally futures thinking. And our practice is kind of a braid of artistic practices, futures thinking, and the bread and butter, which is kind of management consulting and doing some of this stuff as a service.
Awesome. Now, Rob, you're probably one of my oldest foresight friends. I feel like we met when we were both baby foresight practitioners. And I think at that time, most of the folks that we were surrounded by were folks who didn't necessarily have like a formal background in foresight, but had been either doing futures work for a very long time and were like willing to mentor us into it, or like us kind of found our way in through, for myself, it was architecture. For you, it was a number of different things. And so just kind of starting with you, how did you find your way into foresight and future studies? And like go as far back as you want to, like when you were 5, I don't know, maybe you decided you were building imaginary worlds at that point, right? It can be anything, but like if you had to kind of pull a thread through the evolution of, Rob, the futures kid, how did that happen?
I didn't have the interest in sci-fi that is really common among people who are in this field. Like, not particularly. It wasn't necessarily a genre that I was interested in. I was a poet, an artist, a songwriter. That's kind of what I was doing. And I sort of just started practicing something that really resembled futures thinking, though I'd never heard of futures thinking. And I was writing poetry that was narrative, speculative, based on research. And so that I did a project that was like this meditation on identity and the internet. And that was in like around 2006. And it kind of took place between 1986 and 2019. And in that period when I put it out, it ended up being this practice of like looking back into the recent past and kind of plotting a trajectory into the future and drawing that out according to some kind of narrative. Ended up being very weirdly predictive of a lot of things, even like the whole conversation around identity on the internet and, hacktivism, just the ways that that's played out. And so that was just something I was doing. And I wrote a thesis about the iPad through a poetics lens, trying to understand what it meant for us to want to interface with technology as a magical and revolutionary device, which is what the iPad was called. So it's just like weird projects, and what it would be like to hold the internet in your hands, which was all stuff from the like Johnny Ives videos of the time. Like, so I was kind of, I didn't have a design background, so I was looking at this stuff just kind of with my own curiosity and background in kind of like art theory and poetics, and trying to understand it, and got it in my head that there was some value in what I was doing, and so looked for a job and found a consultancy to hire me, which was Idea Couture. And they I remember my interview well, Morgan Gerard, who's was an anthropologist there, said, you seem like the type of weird person with a lot of weird interests that would fit in well here. And got an internship and was kind of determined to stay. I think part of like how I ended up sticking with Foresight involved seeing like, oh, here's a way that maybe I can sustainably make a living doing something that both like feeds my curiosity and allows me to follow my creative compulsions, and that's generally worked out pretty well, and without really compromising having an artistic practice while also doing consulting work. So at that place, Idea Couture, there was a small Foresight department. One of the people there was our mutual friend, Richard Thomas, who was Ricky to me then, and his two colleagues, Matt Lindsay and Sadie Ducros. All three of them were like ex-graffiti writers, turned industrial designers, turned the Foresight team. And I just thought they were like the most interesting people in the building, and really gravitated towards them and like learned from them. And they ended up moving on. And then Carl Schrader, who's like another great practitioner, came and led the Foresight team. And then eventually I was co-leading that team after having been trained by a number of experts on the job, and left and started from later. So yeah,
and we'll dive a little bit more into like the saga of From Later, because I know that's one of the ways that I was actually introduced to Macy, was when Macy, I know that there have been multiple iterations, and there's this beautiful collective called Memory Work that has kind of come out of your initial research on the future of women's work. But the way you and I were originally introduced was an invitation to be on this panel that From Later and a few other groups were hosting to kind of explore the future of women's work. And I remember you gave this really amazing presentation that was an amalgamation of all this research that you had done, and this position that was kind of presented on what the future might be like. It was really a provocation for the basis of, that panel and that discussion. And I'm wondering if you can, again, like Rob, tell us the story of like how you got there. If that's kind of the point where we just pause for a moment. And then two, if you don't mind just sharing a little bit of that initial work, and then we'll get, more deeply into the evolution of that, which ultimately turns into this probably one of my favorite world building projects ever, Memory Work.
Yeah, no, we're so glad you were able to be part of that panel. It was such a wonderful gathering, community gathering, and so much good conversation happened. Okay, my journey is very meandering. I think, unlike Rob, which has this, who is an embrace of all these weirdness, I think I am a very systematic, structured thinker, sometimes to a fault. And like, even as a kid, my mom was like, you were categorizing your books, like trying to put them in order on the shelf, in whatever order, I don't know. So I think there's also like, embrace chaos within structure. And I think this has always been a dichotomy that I struggle with. Is I like to work within some sort of established boundaries, but then I am curious to think about what's outside those boundaries or how to break those boundaries. So yeah, I mean, I've always, like I said, kind of struggled between like the more creative side of me, which embraced the arts even as a kid, and then more the scientific side, also because I love research. And when I got into university, I started in political science, but then I remember a paper that I wrote, the TA was like, your writing is like too much of a narrative tone. And I was like, what do you mean? I was just like, enjoying writing this paper. And in the end, I ended up studying English and art history, and also finally kind of took a jump and did studio art. And then I was, working in the art industry for a while, working within galleries and artist-run centers. And, coming from an Asian immigrant background, my parents were like, what the heck are you doing? Obviously you can't be a doctor now, so you should be a lawyer. And I really adamantly went against that a little bit. I was like, no, I don't want to be a lawyer. I'm like kind of embracing this creative route. I kind of want to be an art administrator, supporting, artists, working within arts organizations. But then I met some really interesting lawyers that really inspired me to think about what you can do when you're able to become well-versed within a certain structure, and then to almost kind of infiltrate it. And I was like, okay. And at the time, I was also seeing a lot of the struggles that artists face within their everyday practice, particularly with, protecting their work, protecting their rights, understanding their rights. And that kind of inspired me to try to get into law school. And I was always interested in intellectual property, both kind of philosophically and practically. And that's how that was my entryway into law. And in the end, I actually really enjoyed the study of law. So thinking about thinking about governance, thinking about these kinds of frameworks, and yeah, the inclusionary aspect as well as the exclusionary aspects of law. And I ended up working within the public sector, so within the federal government. So in a very regulatory body, essentially defending the law. And that's also when I started to see struggles of, so I was at the intellectual property office, and I saw the struggles of, mom and pop shops trying to defend, their trademarks against Bay Street lawyers, and not understanding procedures not being accessible at all. And we all know how convoluted law can be, with all the legalese. And I became more interested in what can be the process of making these procedures more accessible. And this was a time when, the trend of design thinking and all that was starting up, and the government was just latching onto it. And there were, a number of quote unquote innovation hubs and things like that popping up within the public sector. And I became very drawn to how design processes could bring into very entrenched, hard to move institutions, how it can bring in different perspectives and allow us to learn from ultimately the people that we need to surface, and what can more inclusion or inclusive ways of inclusive lawmaking, inclusive policy making look like. And this was a point where I was just really struggling with the law, and I found it very restrictive sometimes as a practice, I guess, because sometimes you have the rare opportunity to kind of present a case when a certain case with certain sets of facts comes in, that you can push a certain viewpoint that is more I guess feature thinking, because it's emergent, right? Emergent practices where, the law is always behind. So it's always catching up. So you sometimes have a rare chance, as a decision writer, to break it open a little and be like, what if this? How can we change what's established to include this practice that is now that's emerging and probably might become mainstream. So I was feeling very restricted sitting in my cubicle. And I started researching more into design and design programs. I was at a point where I think I was ready to really make a jump and try something different. And I was thinking that design could be a really good intersection of my kind of artistic self and this more structured systematic thinking self. And I ended up going to OCAD, particularly because it was a strategic foresight program, but rooted in a creative art school, essentially. So I was keen to have a studio practice as well as that graduate studies academic experience. And that's where kind of the more formal education happened. But I think with most graduate programs, it's really you're learning from your peers, you're learning from your cohort, you're learning from the diversity of experience that's in the room. And interestingly enough, just before I went to OCAD, I was in the federal government, and there was an innovation conference, and I sat in on one of Rob's sessions. And that also really inspired me. I think you were actually talking about one of the projects that you mentioned. And it kind of planted a seed in my head, maybe.
Interesting.
I finished the program, and looking for work was tough, I think. Because at that time, I think foresight has grown a lot. Also, I think the pandemic has also maybe solidified it a little bit as a job, really, something that organizations are starting to look to more formally. And so, I was doing side projects, which had its benefits. I was able to kind of do little passion projects. I did projects around the immigration community, also like bringing artists to the policy table. And it was around this time that I reached out to Rob, I think. And I think the timing was just a little bit miraculous, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Seems like
it was, yeah. And From Later was forming at that time. And I was just really happy for the opportunity to, work on a residency project with Robin Nudit at that time. And things took shape after that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the point you make about, well, one, I love that. I think the path that both of you have kind of been on and found your way through is not dissimilar from like most folks in the space we operate in the future space. I think a lot of us are multidisciplinary, perpetually curious beings who maybe don't always kind of fit into particular roles, or maybe aren't the best corporate citizens, or whatever it might be. And I don't know what it is about those qualities that makes us great as like futures designers and researchers, but they do lend themselves to futures practice. But Macy, I still remember the last event I did before COVID kind of shut everything down and put, the world on pause, was the panel in Toronto looking at the future of women's work. And I remember there were a couple questions in the audience, but one of them, and I thought it was actually a really endearing question, came from your dad.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I can't remember exactly what he asked, but I could tell he was searching for understanding in like the why is my child doing this? Like, what is the value in this practice? Right. And I really appreciated that question because, one, he's not the only person to ask, like, what's the value in foresight practice, right? I get that from like CEOs and executive leaders all the time, but there is this thing about, and I don't know if it's exclusive to like the immigrant experience or the first generation child in another country experience, but of feeling like stepping into a practice like this is a luxury and a privilege. And I think a lot has evolved in futures practice to shift that, but it is something that's not the easiest to reconcile with parents who feel like, what are you doing? You're just sitting there dreaming up stories about the future, and for who, right? It looks like art. It looks like design, but it's not like it's not like buildings or infrastructure or, and I remember like my response at the time, I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember I had this moment on stage where I was like, I think part of what I've realized is like the woman that I am and the woman I was raised to be don't always intersect in the most graceful ways, but this practice has kind of given me permission to ask the questions and bring about the provocations that I wasn't always allowed to kind of bring forward. And I don't know if like what your experience has been in kind of and we don't have to justify, but kind of like in bringing your family along the journey or your loved ones along the journey of the why and the how. And Rob, I would also be interested in just like your experience because, all of our parents have come from a certain generation. Right. And so many of my students often ask me like, how do you do this? Like, how do you allow yourself to get into this space? Like, how do you give yourself permission? Because to some folks, it feels like snake oil, right? Like you're selling snake oil. So, yeah, I'm just curious, just because of kind of personal experience, but.
The one thing I remember that talked about a lot back when Macy and I like first met was just that, the Plato, it's the quote attributed to Plato that one of the penalties for not participating in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. And I always like kind of remixed that to like one of the penalties for not engaging with emerging change is like you end up having no say in that. So like early on in my career, it was like I was kind of all about engaging more people in it, and sort of like all dimensions of like diversity, including like myself feeling like a non-engineer, not coming from the or non-lawyer, scientist, whatever, a non sort of policymaker. Like where do you actually have a voice in determining futures, and just like a real belief that like artists and creative people should have a voice in that. And so it was like really trying to do that, and once I learned that there were like some very simple tools, methods, frameworks that are not at all like, or shouldn't be at all exclusive to anyone. They're not difficult things to learn, and just wanting to like spread that around a little bit more and like get more people having that kind of permission. So through different kinds of projects that were deliberately like engaging people, which was like I designed a board game for Futures Thinking so long ago. That was why it was that thing that Macy mentioned.
What a blast from the past. What was that called?
It was called Impact.
Right. And I think I still have that sitting on my desk somewhere.
Oh yeah.
Limited edition.
I've always been a fan, Robert Bolton.
Yeah. And our work now is like, we always think about our projects as like platforms that is like not just kind of these like fixed, like this is our work kind of thing, but like they're all meant to be worked with and like built on in some way.
Yeah, I think that the instigating conversation part has always been like from the start in thinking about, well, just like getting into the foresight world. That's what's drawn me into, all of those immersive speculative like design installations and experiences and stuff like that. I guess it's like myself experiencing that as someone that had no knowledge or like no really any idea of this field at all, and to be able to experience something, I guess going back to the feeling of the future that Rob always talk about, the feels, and that having an impact on myself and being like, oh, when you can make that connection, and also when you can see somebody else make that connection, that's always like the biggest value to me. And I've also been interested in thinking about personal foresight as well, and how to utilize some of these frameworks and methods to help ourselves think more critically about our contributions to what the world that we want to be in. So yeah, that's like another aspect in terms of how can we bring personal foresight and foresight education like into even like early on, not necessarily like university students, but even just, early education. How can we start those conversations earlier on?
What do y'all think about personal foresight? If I'm futurists, are usually really bad at it. Like we're really always bad at like applying this stuff to our own lives.
I always say I'm really good at helping other people mediate their futures and they're like guide them through their future environments. And I'm horrible at thinking about my own. But the thing I will say is, you two both know that I have like a a 2-and-something-year-old. And seeing the way that she takes in the world, and like she's in this phase of her life or development where like everything is a story and it's amazing. And she builds these imaginary worlds that are just so fun to kind of be part of and like help her usher in. And I've learned so much from that, because I'm like, man, like when did I lose that? Like, when did I lose the ability to just think in an uninhibited fashion, you know? And how can I incite that feeling, not only back into my practice, but to help like my clients and my team to do that as well. And Macy, you mentioned the, you know, Rob's thing about like future feels and like the vibes. And you and I had an opportunity to, you know, you very generously joined me on this panel in Dubai at the Future Forum, where we talked about our kind of personal practices, but we also kind of centered it around some of the audio, like the immersive audio experiences that were developed as part of the memory work project, which I do want to get into. But I think the crux of that, of our work, has always been about, one, kind of helping folks understand that there is value, and that foresight is about, at least from my perspective, this realization that we have some agency over what a preferable future becomes, right? That it's something that can be designed, and that perhaps there is, you know, privilege in that, but everyone should have some agency in kind of deciding. And two, that so much of the most compelling futures work is truly deeply comes down to emotional engagement. And I think the work that From Later does that so well. And so I'd love if you guys can, you know, talk about whatever projects you want, but I really wanted to kind of start with the project that we focused on in Dubai, which has been, I know, many years in kind of, in its evolution, and has turned into this collective. But I'd love to kind of get the story of memory work, and, you know, what it's about, and kind of what it's become now out in the world. So yeah, if you know, either of you would want to pick that up, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, could we go back? If we can go back even before, to just like where we're coming from, why we would do projects in that style, which is just, like the pattern with From Later. The idea was that like you do this futures research, you check out what are these weak signals of change, and you synthesize those into typically like some kind of like report that can help advise somebody on how to navigate their organization, or how to, you know, develop a more resilient policy or whatever. But I always was like, that's like what like artists do in a way. It's like you synthesize all of what's the vibe of the world, what's changing in the world, the signals that are occurring that are indicating what's changing about, you know, the world.
Can I pause you for one? I want to pause you for 1 second. So for those who don't know what signals are, how would you describe what a signal is?
Is something that you notice that's like, you could call it an event, or you could call it like an idea, or something you notice in the world, a development that you notice in the world that you don't fully understand what it is, or depending. When we say weak signals, it means we don't fully understand. It's something kind of faint, but it's on our radar. We do notice it, and we notice it in a way that says like, this seems like this might be significant. Something might change. Things might change in ways that I don't fully understand. And so that instinct sort of warrants like further investigating and analysis of that. And it's usually in light of something that we're already studying, like we're doing a study on a certain domain, future of media or something like that. And then we notice like, oh, there's sure is a lot of virtual influencers or whatever these days. Is that something that might affect the future of media? And and start to unpack that. Yeah.
It's like if you have antennas that's like sensing the vibe of the world, your antenna is like tingling that, you know, this thing, whatever it is, can be an observation, it can be an event, it can be a piece of garbage, is something that might kind of put a wrinkle in that fabric. Might. Yeah.
And so without necessarily having, you know, this language, artists for sure do that. And so I always like recognized that when I was like learning about foresight. I was like, okay, so this is like kind of what we do. Just it's not formalized. You don't necessarily document it in the same way if you're thinking like an artist, but you do that and you sort of crystallize it into an art object typically, as opposed to a PowerPoint presentation or whatever. But I also really believe that, you know, artists were able to reveal something that also wouldn't be revealed by PowerPoint presentations, which can do like a report can tell a story in a very particular linear way, but a work of art can do something else. And so with From Later, we were kind of just like, how do we combine this and get the most out of both, the most out of both types of thinking? And so as an example, like 2015, the first project I did like with the name From Later, a couple of years before we actually like started the firm for real. I did this song Lonely Arcade, which, you know, at that time there was like a book out that was like, I think out of Harvard, and it was like this book that was like giving the probabilities of exactly which jobs would be automated by AI or whatever. Yeah. And it was like, it was kind of everywhere in our world, but it was just like, it said so little. And it's happening a lot again right now. Like there's a lot of just like, these are the jobs that are going to be disrupted by AI with like no explanation of how, like of what's going to change about the job, or is it going to be completely like gone or what, just sort of like some analysis of like the potential for AI to be used in certain activities or whatever. But it was like these percentages that like X number of like percentage of drivers will be truck drivers or professional drivers will be out of work by this date. And I was like, okay, well, like, what is that going to be like? And what is that going to feel like for people? And so Lonely Arcade like took to the like full extreme. And it was like, if the ultimate aim of automation and engineering comes true, and there's almost no work to do, like a very like speculative sort of provocation, what's that world going to be like? And so we wrote like a work song based on like the traditional format of a work song, using the conventions of a work song and as a scaffolding for this research, to think about a world without work. And there is like a little bit of a report with it. There is like a macro scenario describing what this world could be like. And there's a song that you can add to Spotify playlist or whatever From Later, Lonely Arcade, if you look it up. So that was like the first one. And we ended up like continuing this practice. And so like Macy, or like when she did a residency with From Later, was like, you know, like writing sonnets and stuff. And so we have this belief that it's like you take the research and like use the scaffolding of art conventions and formats, as well as like the processes, and like allow yourself to think that way. You learn something that you otherwise might not. And so that's sort of been like our method that we've practiced. So memory work is certainly like been an example of that.
And so memory work has come up through kind of the evolution of the way that you've shaped, you know, From Later's practice. Macy, where did that come from? How did that start? And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so actually it was a really great collaboration with a women's collective here that was founded by Natasha Singh and Alika Hall in Toronto. And I think the intent really was to essentially have a community art piece, an exhibition, utilizing art practice to explore what the futures of women's work could be. that was the original kind of genesis, and it kind of grew in many different ways from there. I think for us from the get-go, we really wanted to take we also had the luxury of a little bit of time, so we wanted to take a bit of a slower approach, as opposed to, you're doing a project for a client and it's like you need to produce something in like 2 weeks or something like that. But we really wanted to take the time to talk with people in the community, talk with women doing really interesting things in the city. And for us, it started off really just be like observing. The signals for us is like, what are people doing within their practice that's interesting or that's emerging, whether it's this idea, this concept of like creative biologists, basically someone's practice rooted in science, but like doing really interesting things with materials, new forms of materials, or someone who's a healer and doing interesting things with that practice. So it really began with a lot of conversations with people we knew and then people they knew, and kind of spawned off like that. And that was a big part of kind of our primary research. And then, of course, there was secondary research as well into looking at, what are the trends that are happening and gathering signals that way. But it's really hard to kind of re-articulate the process because it was very organic in a sense. We kind of went where the research took us and dived deep, but then like zoomed back out at points. And then also at points, it was just like, okay, we have, all this raw material. And this was where, what Rob was talking about, like in terms of, okay, how can we use, creative, established creative forms and like bring that into the material that we have. So I think at some point we just did a lot of like free writing and trying to write stories out of what we have and interweaving it with things that we've heard from those that we've spoken to, things that we've noticed, things that came from STES research also. And ultimately, we found that building out characters was a way that really allowed us to think about, what different roles in terms of work and labor might look like, 10, 20 years down the road, like a midterm future, I guess. And so it really became then a process of building out these characters, thinking about their environment, thinking about who they'll be interacting with. So that was kind of the creative process. And like Rob mentioned before, when we first released this, well, first of all, the exhibition couldn't happen because COVID happened. And at the time, we were already set on doing an audio soundscape that people could immerse themselves with in the exhibition. So we decided to release the soundscape online and really utilize the website, publishing our research, publishing the signals, and that concept of wanting to build it as a platform that this creative material that already has a layer of synthesis can now become raw material for other artists, other researchers, other writers to use to build upon. And then for us, like sound has always been a really potent medium for immersion, and thinking about Rob always mentions this concept of diegetic sound. So within an environment? What are the sounds that are specific to that environment? So like if you're watching a film and you see a car passing by, like what is playing on the radio that would be telling of that world or that time? So it went from, writings of a narrative or a character's story into then thinking about how to create the sound environment of, someone's space within a lab setting or a healer's basement cozy room where they have that healing ritual with their clients. And so the first public iteration was that soundscape and the research within the website as kind of this platform. And then from there, the scenario really became rooted in Toronto as kind of a grounded local community that everyone that collaborated on the project have connection to, and also where we drew a lot of our inspiration. And back to, that element of emotional engagement that you were talking about, we really wanted to manifest that in the city that it's written about. And so for me, public art always has been a really interesting medium in terms of kind of the bridge between community and public engagement, like en masse, and also the duty to do that in a very intentional way, and then also for it to be art as well, but not like art on a pedestal, like on a wall. You take what you can from it. So that kind of became a bit of a vision as to like how can we bring this and manifest it in our city. And and then it ended up spawning into this other iteration, which is the mural, or what we're calling a monument from the future, monument from later, which is now located at the Bentway in Toronto. Yeah.
And for those of us who maybe aren't familiar with Toronto, the Bentway is an outdoor.
Yeah, so the Bentway is actually a really, really interesting space. It's the whole underbelly of a major highway, the Gardiner Expressway, that runs across the whole city. So it's really about utilizing infrastructure in spaces that might otherwise potentially be neglected and being able to activate it for public events, for creative endeavors. So yeah, it's a little bit like the High Line in New York, but on the underside. Yeah.
I think it's, as someone who kind of sits on the outside of your practice, I really love the ways that well, let me back up for a second. I think as much as I love speculative design and future studies, one of the critiques of the work that we do as a genre is that a lot of the outputs either end up in like executive boardrooms and tall glass towers, or on white gallery walls that aren't always accessible to everybody. And I think one of the things that I found so compelling about the work that From Later does is, you're putting out future scenarios as songs on Spotify, or putting together a monument to the future at the Bentway in a public forum for people to kind of just pass by and experience. And I wonder, in doing that, how have you found that has maybe expanded the audience and the type of kind of discourse that you've been able to have in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, for memory work, I guess the audience is a lot wider than any typical project you would expect to have in our field. It's beginning with this soundscape that's on a website, and the research behind it as a kind of platform that kind of just mushroomed into a very like high traffic public monument, where people can engage with it, and there's a phone line where you can like call in. It's quite accessible to learn more about each of the individual people that are depicted, who are all meant to be the leaders of this sort of revolution towards a new economic paradigm, socioeconomic paradigm for Toronto. So a lot of people are passing by and seeing this all the time and engaging with it. And it just continue. I mean, we're always kind of surprised. Macy and I like stay busy doing like press and stuff like this now, because it's just like it's kind of being like documented, and like I wouldn't say like I mean, maybe in this field, I was hesitant to say canonized within like the futures, canon or whatever, but it's not just like within our field necessarily. It's like publications that are like looking at monuments or looking at public art or looking at art in general that are all interested in covering this project. And then there's artists, because we do put it out there as like this is meant to be a platform for people to work with and build on, so you're not necessarily starting from scratch doing the world building or research. There's been artists who have worked from it and created their own works. And then we've also done workshops, like we did a workshop called World Building with Textiles, where people were using like the apron as a canvas, and everybody was like there working with their hands, sewing, making aprons for like the roles of the future jobs, and like actually doing that imagination work, like in a tactile way, rather than it being like this sit, think, and write kind of task, as it often is for someone who thinks of themselves as a foresight strategist or futurist, whatever. So it reached a lot of people, but also they're participating in it in very real ways. This isn't like, I don't know, participatory art often to me has like can be cheapened as a term, but I feel like the engagement in this project's like, it's really like whole. That makes, it feels really whole. There's a,
it feels more tangible, as someone who's kind of like maybe a spectator of the work. I wanted to switch gears just a little, because From Later has a series on YouTube called Broadcasts, and it's you have folks on the show. I'm afraid I didn't want to say that part, but okay.
You're a regular.
I'm a regular. Now my husband is too.
Yes. Right.
We're slowly pulling him into foresight. But no, I think, and as with so much of your practice, you're starting to make the conversation around weak signals of change more accessible, and kind of bringing that out of, the brainstorm synthesis sessions we might have as a foresight team. And I'm just curious for both of you, what feels like maybe a futures issue or a topic that's like top of mind right now, that's just feeling a little bit maybe all consuming, or like helping to, nourish your curiosity at the moment.
I really feel there needs to be more coverage of AI. It's not enough.
Please, God, no, please. There's too much noise.
Can I say something about the broadcast from later? As you were saying, that
yes,
is like,
for sure.
I just want to be like real about this. Is that something I think is lame about our field, is that so much of the work that happens is people publishing methods, and you cannot find examples of them having actually used them. And so like that is where like we're just like, okay, with broadcast from later, let's just like do this. weak signal scanning in front of people, which is like embarrassing because it's, as I always say on the show, the disclaimer, like this is us not knowing what we're talking about, which is the whole point.
Truly, deeply.
And so many futurists posture as like, I know something you don't know, therefore you should hire me. Where like the nature of the work is you have to not know. That's the whole point of it. Like the whole idea, people say this curiosity, like they're driven by curiosity, but will not show themselves not knowing, which is like you cannot really grow or progress develop an idea in this field without doing that. And anyway, same with all of the rest of it. It's like I'd rather see people actually show the outputs of their work rather than this is a method for how you might do futures work, which seems to dominate for some reason.
It's funny because I did a foresight program, right? And I remember learning about signals, and it was just like so nebulous. I was like, okay, so where do you look for signals? Like, how do you find it? What's a signal? Like, where? And I remember, I think it was like the class right after we talked about weak signals, and it's just so hard to grasp. And I remember like literally asking the professor, like, where do you find signals? And she was like, anywhere, literally anywhere. And I was just like, okay, that doesn't help me. So yeah, I wish broadcasts, existed then, because then it would have been very helpful to get, out of the methods mindset and actually see it in action.
There's a guy in a strip mall in Brampton that I go to where I get my signals. He's there every third Sunday of the month. And,
a guy who knows a guy.
Yeah. Yeah. So you gotta find a plug and you can get your signals.
So what's your weakest signal, Rob?
My weakest signal. At this very moment. Okay, a signal. This is a very like internal one, but is a question. It's sort of meta too. Noticing that, I guess what I just said, that the things everybody is talking about in future studies right now are the same things that everybody was talking about a decade ago. So AI and automation, climate, and sort of like fear stuff, authoritarianism, war, and so on. And so I'm just like wondering now, is future studies like really equipped for the moment? It feels like there's probably, I feel like many people probably have the sense that like they were like, oh yeah, we were like right on top of this a decade ago. Like those of us who have been in the field, like I don't feel totally surprised sometimes by the pace of things, sure, but there's like definitely this feeling now. The signal is that like do we need to look at signals right now to see where we're going? It's the feeling. Maybe the signal. It's like there's a feeling that we're in the future that didn't exist. Like when you and I met 10 years ago, we thought about like the future as like somewhere forward. And now everybody who's doing futures work is dealing with the present, and it's almost like if we were to like think about this period, you would just think of it it's the future. We're here now. You know what I mean? All of the stuff that everybody's anticipating. And so like, what is something that we're like, I know we can have ideas of like what AI is going to come next or what climate disaster, but all of these things are playing out right now. And so it like, is futures thinking like what's equipped? Is this like anticipation, weak signal, like sort of predictive, even though we all refuse to say that it's predicting, it's preparing, but are we prepared? Were we prepared? And and what are we preparing for? What are we preparing for now? So that's the question. I'm like I did my job. Now we're in the future. Now what?
Yeah. I do feel that. I do feel like we're, I've been saying for maybe the last few months that like I need a sabbatical from Foresight. And I don't think it's because I don't like Foresight. I love this, like I love Futures work. I love Futures practice, but I think I need a minute to pause and like regroup, because I feel like we're at this inflection point, you know, and we're kind of at this moment of the culmination of a lot of research that's been going on for 10 and 15 years, and probably even longer with the folks who've been mentoring us. But I think you're right, you know, that like we're in the future that we've been talking about for ages, you know. But Macy, what's your weakest signal? What's been top of mind for you?
I don't know about weakest signal, but I've been thinking a lot about libraries. It's funny, I've always been thinking about these like third spaces, because Rob will tell you I did a project on the futures of malls before. At the crux when, you know, all the dead malls.
I was thinking of that today, by the way. Sorry.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I was thinking about your malls work, and yeah.
Yeah, like at the crux when a lot of dead malls were happening, and I guess that's still happening, but I'm actually seeing some of that become real now. But for me, well, at least in Toronto, we just had like a huge library cyber attack, and it created this void for a lot of people, including myself. I'm like, I need to reserve books and put books on hold, and
it shut down the library.
We love our local
months.
Library. Oh my goodness!
I know it shut down for I think like 2 months or something. It's just coming back now, which is great. And yeah, so that's been top of mind for me in terms of like, are we going to lose these spaces at some point, and what can we do about it? I know there's already been like a lot of interesting things that's been, you know, our Toronto Reference Library is such a, you know, space for all these different things. Like there are 3D printer maker spaces and stuff in there. But yeah, like as a crucial like community third space, what could become of libraries in the future? That's kind of what I've been thinking about lately. I don't really have any answers, but yeah.
You know what? We need to be thinking about libraries. It's important. How do we collect, store, disperse our knowledge? Amazing. Well, I wanted to just thank both of you for taking the time to chat with me and for trusting the process of this conversation. And yeah, just very, very, very grateful for you lending your brains for a little while. So thank you, Rob and Macy.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you to you.
Thank you for tuning in to Future Feelings in collaboration with Deem Audio. You can find our other 5 episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google, as well as explore Deem's podcasting program at deemjournal.com/audio. To keep up with my work, follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Radha_Mistry.